Well, last week we talked about honor and how honor and respect is disappearing from the American landscape and can have an effect on us, and it is important for all of us to be respectful of each other and keep that in mind, that part of the way we honor God is the way we treat each other and the way we look out for each other and the way we honor and respect each other. Today I want to talk about honoring God, because as important it is as it is for all of us to honor and respect each other, to honor and how we respect God is even more important than that. You know, God has given us a very great gift in calling us and making us part of His family and letting us know what we know today. And there's many things we do to honor Him. You know, there's many words that you could come up with. If I was going to ask, how do we honor God? We would say, well, we worship Him, we love Him, we trust Him, we rely on Him, we depend on Him, we thank Him, and all those things are true. All those things are true, and all those things we should do. But there is one word and one thread in the Bible that goes from Genesis all the way to the end of the Bible, that started in the Old Testament, of course, way back after Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, that applies for all mankind until the time for mankind's time on earth and physical mankind is up. And that word that we'll talk about today, we can find, as I said, back at the beginning of the Bible. So let's go back to Genesis 4. And in Genesis 4, we have the time Adam and Eve have rejected God. They've taken to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They decided they want to do things their own way. They want to make their own way, their own judgments, and not follow God. And in chapter 4, they have children. Now you remember at the end of chapter 3, they're ushered out of Eden. God does show that there will be a Messiah. A Messiah that will come, that will reconcile man to God again. But in chapter 4, they have two sons. Let's just pick it up in chapter 4, verse 1. It says, Adam knew Eve his wife. She conceived and bore Cain, and said, I've acquired a man from the Eternal. And then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Eternal. Also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat. And God respected Abel and his offering, but He didn't respect Cain and his offering. Cain, as you remember, was very angry, and that led to the murder of Abel. So here, very early in the Bible, we have a concept that we see throughout it. Cain and Abel, somewhere along the line, God instructed them, when you approach me, when you come before me with an offering. Come before me with a sacrifice. You do something when you approach me. Now, when you look at the Hebrew word that's translated offering there, it comes from this Strong's number 4503. It's defined as a gift offered to a divinity, a sacrifice, often used for sacrifice that is not a bloody sacrifice. So when you see offering in the Old Testament, offering, it's a voluntary thing. It's not maybe with animals, but it's something that people are sacrificing to God, giving something of themselves, something of value to them, to God. When you read the word sacrifice, it often has to do with an animal being sacrificed and blood being spilled, and you remember what that pictures in God's plan and how Jesus Christ perfectly fulfilled those sacrifices. But here we have Cain and Abel coming before God. They both come before an offering. They know that they're going to approach God. They need to come before Him with a sacrifice. Cain comes with a sacrifice of the fruit of the ground. An appropriate sacrifice when you look in Leviticus, where it talks about the various sacrifices that later God re-instructs Israel that they need to do. But God doesn't have respect for Cain's sacrifice. He does have respect for Abel's sacrifice. Abel sacrificed one of the firstborn of his flock. And when God looked at the attitudes, if you will, of the two young men who came before him, one, He said, you've got the right attitude in approaching me. You sacrificed exactly the way I said, and you're coming before me with the exact attitude that you should have when you come before me. But Cain, on the other hand, it doesn't say whether it was the first fruits of what he had grown or just any old offering that he put together to bring before God, because he was just going through the motions. He just thought, okay, we know that if we're going to approach God, we need to do this. I've got to bring an offering to Him. Let me just throw something together, and hey, I fulfilled His requirement. But God sees more deeply than just what we physically do. He was looking for more from those two young men, as He was through the people of the Old Testament who sacrificed and who always approached God with sacrifices. And we learn something in there that when we approach God, sacrifice is something that is part of the definition. Sacrifice is part of worship. Sacrifice is part of the love of God. Sacrifice is part of the trust of God, faith in God, dependence in God, reliance on God, and all those things that we do. Now, it's not only Cain and Abel who sacrificed. Let's go forward a few chapters here to Noah. Noah, of course, the only family that was saved through the great flood. God prepared an ark for them. And as they exited the ark after the flood, and all the earth was destroyed, every living thing except Noah and his family had died, obviously they were quite thankful. As well they should be, as you and I would be, when we saw God naturally, preserve us through such a traumatic experience. And in chapter 8 of Genesis, in verse 21, let's begin in verse 20. After they exited, it says, Noah built an altar to the Eternal, and he took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar. Now, as he got off of the ark, what he did first, build an offer, took of those clean animals and clean birds, and he offered a burnt offering. He was approaching God and thanking God exactly the way God had taught him. If you're going to come before me, even in thanksgiving, bring something. Acknowledge me, sacrifice something. And as God looked at Noah's attitude, as he saw his heart, as he saw the thankfulness that was in him, and what he had done and how he did what he did and how he came before God in exactly the way God had instructed him to honor him, it says in verse 21 that God smelled a soothing aroma. It was pleasant to him. It was good for him to see the complete submission of Noah, to see the complete gratitude of Noah and his family, the complete yieldedness to him, an acknowledgement that everything they did and the fact that God brought them through that time was there. Sacrifices were a soothing aroma. In the physical sense, maybe God was doing that, but in the spiritual sense, it was a soothing aroma to God to see the attitude of Abel, to see the attitude of Noah. A few chapters later, chapter 22, we see Abraham, a man of God, an example for all of us of how he yielded to God and how he approached God, the relationship that he had with God. God called him a friend. And everything that God asked Abraham to do, he did. Sacrifice was part of his life, part of his worship for God, and it came to the point where God in chapter 22 asked him to give the most valuable thing to him, to offer it to him. Genesis 22, and in verse 2, God said to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Offer that to me. I know how important Isaac is to you. I know how much you love him. Come to me and give him to me. Offer him as a sacrifice, a burnt offering. Abraham didn't even hesitate. Abraham knew what God wanted, and Abraham was willing to sacrifice even Isaac to show God how much he honored him, worshiped him, loved him, trusted in him, had faith in him, knew that he would provide, knew that he was everything, and above everything, even Isaac, he was willing to sacrifice. And so as you go through the story, you know it. Noah was just that close to sacrificing Isaac when God said, "Don't do it." Now I know, Noah, or now I know Abraham, that there's nothing you won't withhold from me. There's nothing that you wouldn't sacrifice for me. And so down in verse 12 is exactly what he says, and God said, "Don't lay your hand on the lad, don't do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you haven't withheld your son, your only son, from me." There was still a sacrifice to be given. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horn. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. Even in that, God provided the offering, the sacrifice. And Abraham willingly offered it. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." Something and a name we could often remember. God will provide. God looked at the soothing aroma that went up from Abraham's willingness to sacrifice, to do the things that he said, the attitude that he had toward God, that I won't withhold anything. I won't withhold anything from you because I trust you and worship you that much. Later on in Genesis, chapter 31. Chapter 31, we find Jacob. Jacob, by this time, has left his mother and father. He's gone to Laban. He's married Leah. He's married Rachel. He's had sons and daughters, and now he's left Laban, going back to reconcile or going back to his homeland. But on the way, after he leaves Laban, Laban finds out that he's left. He didn't bother telling him that he was going to leave. And there's an issue that arises between the two men as Laban comes and says, you've done this, you've done that, and everything. And there's a relationship problem that's here. So in chapter 31 and verse 54, as they talk and as they've come together, it just says Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain. He offered a sacrifice on the mountain. And he called his brethren to eat bread. And they ate bread, and they stayed all night on the mountain. Well, here's a sacrifice. You come before God, engage him, and then they stay and they eat. And they stayed all night on the mountain. And early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his sons and daughters and blessed them. And then Laban departed and returned to his place. And the relationship is back in order. So throughout Genesis, we can see before there ever was a nation of Israel, before there ever was Mount Sinai, God is the one who defined it. God is the one who made it happen.